Hi, I'm Jeremy Foster. Welcome to our very first Talroo Frontline Worker Index on air. And so what we're going to do today is talk about a number of economic factors. We'll try to provide some high-level context of the economy as a whole, and then we'll spend a good bit of time really digging in more deeply on some of the statistics that we're seeing both within Talroo's own proprietary data set, as well as some of the broader trends that we're seeing through third-party data that we have available and that we review. So again, we want to provide some context up front. And if you're here just for the all the fun and pretty graphs where we talk about the labor markets, you can probably skip the next 5-10 minutes. But we're going to talk a little bit, first of all, about the context within which we're kind of viewing the labor markets. And so I think while there's certainly a lot of political exposition on both sides today about the general state of the economy, I think everybody knows that the general trend is we've got pretty low unemployment. We've had pretty high inflation, which has largely come back under control over the course of the last couple of years. And everybody, as of today, is waiting with bated breath, with the markets pretty much expecting that a Fed funds rate cut is going to be coming forth in the next couple of days. And today the markets are pricing in essentially a 2 out of 3 chance that that's a 0.5 percentage point cut, and a 1 out of 3 chance at a 1/4 point cut. The markets would be shocked to see no cut at all. And at this point, I would say that I have no insight that in any way, shape, or form would allow me to take a bet against what the broader markets have said on that. I think those are probably about the right odds. Now, that said, it's really useful to understand some of the underpinnings at a much more detailed level than we've had any conversation about, in terms of really understanding what's been driving the economy, what's starting to drive changes in the economy, and how that may start to have implications for labor markets. So the first thing we want to look at here is U.S. retail sales, and you can tell that this has been a pretty strong upward trend over the course of the last 5 years. That dip, as I'm sure you can guess, at the early second quarter of 2020 is the initial hits that we took from COVID as everything kind of froze. But overall, U.S. retail sales have continued their pretty consistent upward trajectory. And the key thing to remember here is that you can't just look at the overall dollar amount of sales to really understand the productive capacity of the country, or the productive output of the country, because inflation weighs into that. So, and we have had a higher period of inflation over the course of the last 4 years. So a more meaningful view is what we talk about as real GDP, real gross domestic product, which is essentially adjusting for that impact in the value of the dollar by chaining, in this case, with this graph that we're looking at here, chaining dollar output and dollar value to 2017 dollars. And so what this is essentially showing us is, if everything today were priced at the same price as it was in 2017, what would the trend have been? And you can see that this is still pretty significant GDP growth over the course of really the last 10 years. We've had a pretty good run as an economy in growing our productive capacity. Now, there are some things that really still weigh pretty negatively on that. One is, one component of GDP is it's all of the goods and services produced by labor within the U.S. and property within the U.S. And so essentially, regardless of who the buyer of that GDP is, it's showing up here. And what that means is, when we are in a position where more and more spending is coming from government, that means that there is more and more dependency upon government spending. And that is something that we have to think about. But overall, when you look at real GDP, we haven't seen dramatic or meaningful differences in the long-term growth trend of the U.S. over the course of the last 10 years. The numbers are still up and to the right, and they're up and to the right pretty consistently, even adjusting for inflation. Now, the other thing that's really worth thinking about when we talk about inflation, particularly over the course of the last 4 years, is that where the inflation is coming from matters a lot, right? So it's important not just economically, it's important politically, it's important really from the perspective of being able to make sound investment decisions as a company or as an individual. It's really worth understanding what prices have increased. And so this next graph is really looking at the 12-month percentage of change by expenditure category. Now, it's also worth looking at longer term trends in this, but when you look at this graph, it becomes very, very clear that despite all the discussion today about inflation, through August of 2024, when you look at the overall blended inflation rate, there is a single headline number everybody talks about, but when you look at what's happened to prices of fuel, which have actually fallen 10% over the last 12 months, versus the prices of the cost of rent and the price of housing, which have risen 4.4% to 5% over the last 12 months, it starts to become pretty apparent that, you know, our real cost drivers over the last 12 months, the last component of inflation to really come down in response to the Fed's restrictive monetary funding policies, is housing. And this has been an ongoing topic of conversation that, you know, really people in that industry have talked about, but outside that industry, there hasn't been that much conversation. There hasn't been a lot of awareness of the fact that, look, food has been at 2% for the last 12 months. Other services have been around 3% for the last 12 months. Transportation costs have come down. Computer costs have come down. Fuel costs have come down. And those aren't just reductions in the rate of inflation. Those are real reductions in price. So that becomes pretty important and pretty relevant when you start to think about, you know, where there may be still some room for prices to fall further, where there may be some exposures as an individual investor. So, for example, I would strongly suspect that what we're seeing in terms of the trend of housing costs, those prices are likely to continue to come down. I think we're going to see probably certainly the National Association of Realtors, the Mortgage Bankers Association are both forecasting slower home price appreciation. There are going to be significant pockets in the US where housing prices come down, and they may come down dramatically. And so if you're making individual investments, be sure you're looking at this thing on a hyper-local level. The other thing that is really worth having some context around this is again, as voters, again, without getting into politics in any way, shape, or form, if we're looking at what's actually happened in fuel costs, first of all, it's oil is a very volatile commodity. And so, you know, we need to be aware of the fact that looking at any single point in time can be disingenuous. It's probably not a great call to say, well, oil prices in 2024, in January of 2024 were higher than they were in January of 2020, but they were. Oil's cost per barrel in January of 2020 was $56.55, and in January of 2024, it was $72.26. However, if we're going to argue that that justification means that inflation has been driven primarily by fuel cost increases, that's simply untrue. If you look back to what fuel costs were in 2016, January of 2016, they were at $27. And by January of 2020, they rose to $56 a barrel. And by January of 2024, they rose to $72 a barrel. And if you kind of look at the data in the broader context of this, yes, fuel prices rose dramatically up until 2022. 2022 is our big spike in oil's price per barrel, and it's been pretty consistently coming down since then. Housing, in many ways, is also worth really kind of looking at, because housing's real challenges have been a function of the fact that we have not had sufficient housing supply. So this is looking at the number of US housing starts since 1960. And if you look at the US housing starts since 1960, you can see that when we hit the Great Recession in 2006, 2007, and that led to a massive reduction in the amount of new homes that we were building as a nation. And while home prices began to recover, builders didn't really get back to a normal level of new home construction until 2019, 2020. And then as soon as they did, we went through this massive drop in production as a result of COVID that created several months worth of less actual home construction than we'd been at. And we've just now kind of started to recover from that. And so we have all of this really pent up lack of housing supply, particularly in areas where people want to be moving to today. And that lack of housing supply from 2007 on through 2020 is a huge part of what's driven home prices up. And so as we start to really think about where those costs sit, that starts to inform, again, individual investment decisions. But also it really does start to inform where would we expect to see the labor markets move, right? So if I were a betting man, what would I say would probably be a reasonable place to bet that there are going to be some jobs available? I would say that residential construction has some room for people to get hired. I would expect that that's a place where we will start to see more construction. There are demographic factors that start to weigh in too, right? We also are in a position where we're about to see one of the larger generations, reaching a stage in their life where they're, moving out of their own homes. So that may weigh down on some of that. But for the most part, these impacts are worth looking at sector by sector. And so with that, we'll go ahead and transition and start to talk a little bit about what we see in what we call our Frontline Worker Index. And this is, again, really focused on a couple of major data sets. One is within the data that we have available of looking at jobs being posted, workers applying, and we start to see some pretty meaningful shifts and changes over the course of the last few years. The no degree required index is showing at 91 today. That's basically saying that there are fewer positions available for people who don't have degrees than were there when we first started benchmarking this index. We're down from 100 to 91. And so as a result, we're seeing more jobs that are looking for degrees and fewer jobs as a percentage that are not requiring a degree. Employers are starting to ask for degrees more often. We are seeing less remote work activity, fewer remote work positions listed and available than we saw a year ago. And everybody hears about this return to office movement, and the data supports that. The data is showing that while people may still want to be working from home, there are fewer remote work jobs available being posted by employers. Entry-level index is relatively steady at 98. That's really close to what we've been tracking. And while these graphs are, not starting from a zero origin, which you've got to keep in mind, when you look at the raw change, this index has been very, very steady. And so, most of the frontline worker roles that we're tracking to, it's typically fluctuated anywhere between 98 and 100. So most of these are entry-level positions. And there's very little change in those entry-level positions. Hourly wages have risen from $17.25 back in January. So we are seeing higher wages. And you would expect that, again, given the inflation trends that we've seen over the last few years. The percentage of positions that are full-time has fluctuated a lot more than the percentage of positions that are entry-level. This has kind of varied over the last couple of years, anywhere between a low of about 92 points to a high of about 101 points. And again, we're indexing these. So we're looking at the number of full-time positions as a percentage of the total positions, and then we're comparing it to January 2022 as a baseline at 100. So if it's 92, then we've seen essentially a reduction of about 8% kind of weighted relative to that. And if it's at 101 like it is today, then it's slightly above. Average sign-on bonuses have actually varied pretty dramatically as a percentage. They started at 47.86 back in the very beginning of tracking this index back in January. They spiked up to 77.56 in February of 2023, and they're back down to 47.86. So that's a decent proxy for the short-term pressure that employers are feeling to try to secure frontline workers. They're paying higher wages overall today than they were in February of 2023, a year and a half ago. But the sign-on bonuses have fallen dramatically. There's less pent-up demand. And then again, when we look at kind of the hourly wage index, this is at 118 again versus 100 as kind of the starting point in January 2022. So an easy way to read that is hourly wages are basically up about 18% over the course of the last couple of years. Part-time index is another one that's got some very strong seasonal impacts. So if you look at January of 2022, again, as our baseline at 100, but you can see some big trends towards hiring in the back, really in the back quarter. There's a lot of warehouse worker, logistics roles, a lot of people hiring for the holidays. And so you can really kind of see this index spikes at 152 in December of 2023, and then promptly drops to 127 in January and down to 103. So those are seasonal impacts. We are expecting to see a similar seasonal surge, maybe not to the same degree as in 2023, but we do expect to see seasonal hiring surge over the course of the next few months. And then the last thing that we're looking at in the Frontline Worker Index is the percentage of offers that actually include a bonus. So one thing to look at is the average sign-on bonus amount. Another is how many offers include a bonus. And those bonuses were being more consistently offered back in January at 9.5 of 2022 at 9.5%, hit a low of 5.2% in February of this year. Have trended back up to about 8.1% of offers include a signing bonus. So overall, we do see what continues to be a relatively strong, but certainly less strong than in 2022 demand for frontline workers. We do expect to see continued demand for frontline workers. Some of the things that we saw a couple of years ago, including layoffs, we're seeing less of that activity. We are seeing workers stay in their positions. From what we can tell from looking at resume activity and everything else, we're seeing workers that posted a lot of additional resumes in the first half of this year. The first 6 months of 2024, there were roughly as many resumes posted on the major job sites as there were in all of 2023. We've seen some of that start to trend down, whether that's because more of those people have found the jobs they want, whether that's because workers are staying in their roles longer, or whether that's because some of those workers are still waiting to see where that application surge has shaken out. We aren't entirely sure what's driving that, but that is what the data is showing. Overall, I think the trend is less volatility in labor markets, less high pent-up demand for workers than we saw during the recovery of 2021 and early 2022 as we came out of COVID. And we are seeing a more normalized and more normal return to kind of a what I would call a more balanced labor market. And for us, again, most of that data shows up in the Frontline Worker Index. And so if you have questions, we're always happy to hear from you. And appreciate your time and attention.